The Bridge at Remagen wasn't just John Guillermin's most underrated war film. It was a geopolitical crisis disguised as a motion picture that nearly ended in an international incident, a $1,500,000 location catastrophe, and 80 crew members fleeing Soviet tanks in a convoy of taxis. We are digging into the wreckage of the Bridge at Remagen with 20 secrets the studio tried to bury. Secrets locked inside out of print production reports, Variety trade filings, the unpublished memoirs of crew members who were there, and the bitter biography of the greatest American novelist nobody paid enough. The source material was a 1957 nonfiction bestseller written by Ken Hechler, a man who was, simultaneously, a sitting United States congressman from West Virginia. Hechler had actually been at Remagen in March 1945 as a combat historian, and his book was as close to primary testimony as published war literature gets. When David Wolper's production company acquired the rights in 1965, Hechler revealed in subsequent interviews that the studio's opening offer was $5,000 for the use of his book, a number that, for a best-selling account of one of the most significant tactical events of the Second World War, constituted an insult so brazen it had to be deliberate. The studio's fallback position was even more revealing. If Hechler held out for more money, they would simply retitle the film The Remagen Bridge and base it entirely on newspaper accounts of the battle, which were public domain. The difference between The Bridge at Remagen and The Remagen Bridge was, legally, the difference between owing a congressman money and owing him nothing. Hechler accepted the original terms, but the real problem was that the title was the least contentious thing about the 11 years it had taken to get the project to a camera at all. Before David Wolper acquired the rights, this story had already destroyed the ambitions of everyone who touched it. In May 1958, Bud Schulberg, whose On the Waterfront had remade American cinema 4 years earlier, purchased the film rights through his own production company, intending to shoot the project as The Day We Crossed the Rhine with financing from Columbia Pictures. Schulberg had personally witnessed the crossing as a naval officer in 1945. He had authority over the material that no Hollywood professional could manufacture. He also had, according to Variety trade reports from 1958, Stanley Kubrick attached as director, a fact so buried in production history that most contemporary accounts of Kubrick's filmography omit it entirely. When Columbia withdrew and the Mirisch Company and United Artists entered the picture in 1960, promising a 1961 start date, the film dissolved again. United Artists then assigned Phil Carlson, whose career never recovered the momentum he had built through the 1950s. Carlson's version collapsed too. By the time Wolper arrived with his six-picture United Artists deal in 1965, the project had consumed a decade of other men's professional ambitions without a single frame being shot. This is exactly why Wolper's first instinct was not to find the best director, it was to find any director who could actually finish the film. Once Irvin Kershner, Wolper's original director, departed the project during the long development phase, John Guillermin was brought aboard in April 1968. Guillermin was a British director with a genuine gift for kinetic action, demonstrated most clearly in The Blue Max 2 years earlier. What the production's publicity materials carefully avoided discussing was the film's overwhelming structural debt to The Longest Day, Darryl Zanuck's 1962 multi-perspective D-Day epic. The narrative grammar is nearly identical, an ensemble of morally differentiated characters on both sides of a single military objective, crosscut to build to a confrontation that both sides approach with competing and equally doomed imperatives. The TCM program notes for Remagen acknowledge the influence openly. Wolper's promotional materials at the time did not. The debt was not plagiarism in any actionable sense. It was inheritance claimed without attribution. But the real problem was a genealogy even closer to home that the film's script development exposed with embarrassing clarity. The screenplay of The Bridge at Remagen passed through more hands than the studio ever publicly enumerated. Roger Herson delivered the original story treatment in 1965, establishing what he described in his own notes as the project's foundational dynamic. This is the story of two men and a bridge. Richard Yates was then brought in and paid $25,000 for his draft, a payment that, in the context of Yates's catastrophic personal finances at the time, represented survival money rather than creative opportunity. Rod Serling, creator of The Twilight Zone, one of the most commercially valuable writer brands in American television, was subsequently hired for another $25,000 and produced material that was incorporated into the shooting script without receiving any screen credit whatsoever. Ray Rigby was brought in specifically to deepen the characters. Ted Strauss, a Wolper executive whose documentary writing credits made him an unusual choice for a combat feature, worked on the material without credit. William Roberts, who had co-written The Magnificent Seven, ultimately finalized the script's elements. The protagonist's name alone went through 5 iterations. Earl Ammerman, Floyd Love, Michaels, and finally Phil Hartman, first named Kurt, then Vic, before landing on Phil. The script that reached the screen represented the accumulated labor of at least 7 writers, 2 of whom were paid significant sums and received no acknowledgement in the finished film. This is exactly why the finished screenplay feels simultaneously lean and oddly underpopulated, the product of too many hands pulling in too many directions, with the seams smoothed by professionals who were themselves uncredited. Richard Yates deserves his own examination, because what his participation in the Bridget Remagen represents is one of the more quietly devastating portraits of literary genius and financial desperation in post-war American culture. By 1965, when Wolper hired him to draft the screenplay, Yates had already published Revolutionary Road, a novel that received a National Book Award nomination, earned comparisons to F. Scott Fitzgerald from critics, and was described by Kurt Vonnegut as the work of a writer of extraordinary honesty and precision. It had also failed to make Yates financially comfortable by any measure. He had written speeches for Robert F. Kennedy. He had taught at the Iowa Writers' Workshop. He had been hospitalized for what he later described in a characteristic flash of self-deprecating precision as having been in and out of bug houses. The $25,000 Wolper paid him for a war film screenplay was not a detour from his literary career. It was the condition under which his literary career continued to exist at all. His draft survived in the final film primarily as structural scaffolding, visible if you know where to look, uncredited in the ways that mattered most to him. But the real problem was that by the time Yates's work reached the screen, the production had become something far larger and more chaotic than any screenwriter's draft could have anticipated. The Bridget Remagen was one of the first major American productions to shoot behind the Iron Curtain, accessing Czechoslovakia during the brief liberalization of Alexander Dubček's Prague Spring government in 1967 and 1968. The production's presence in Prague almost immediately generated a set of accusations from Soviet-aligned press organs that were, in their internal logic, not entirely unreasonable. Soviet agents circulated claims that David Wolper was a Central Intelligence Agency operative. Reports published in communist newspapers alleged that the weapons being imported as film props were in fact real armaments intended to supply Czech reformers. Photographs of stored movie props were published internationally as documentary evidence of weapons shipments from the United States of America. It was reported with apparent seriousness that busloads of American troops were arriving in Prague disguised as tourists and film technicians. The soldiers in the film were in fact Czech university students hired as extras. The weapons were props, but the accusations were not entirely absurd, given that an American film crew was simultaneously constructing fake military fortifications in a Warsaw-packed country during one of the tensest periods of the Cold War, and that the visual difference between a prop armament and a functional one is not immediately obvious from a surveillance photograph. This is exactly why what happened on the morning of August 21st, 1968 felt, to the people who lived through it, less like a production interruption and more like a prophecy fulfilling itself. The cast and crew of the Bridget Remagen woke on August 21st, 1968, to find their hotel in Czechoslovakia surrounded by Soviet armored vehicles. Operation Danube, the Warsaw Pact invasion that ended the Prague Spring and installed a Soviet-loyal government in Prague, had begun in the night, and approximately 250,000 troops had crossed into Czechoslovakia while the production slept. What followed was one of the more extraordinary logistical evacuations in Hollywood history. 80 production personnel were organized into a convoy of 28 taxis and driven through the single checkpoint that remained open, their departure coinciding almost exactly with the arrival of Soviet paratroopers at the same location. One crew member, Robert Logan, did not join the convoy. He remained behind, concealing himself with his camera equipment, and spent the invasion documenting it, footage that became historically significant and was later dramatized in a 2007 British Broadcasting Corporation radio production in which Robert Vaughn played himself. But the real problem was that the production had already spent months and a significant portion of its budget in Czechoslovakia, and leaving meant that approximately $1,500,000 in completed work was now stranded in a country under Soviet military occupation. Before the invasion interrupted everything, the production had secured permissions from Czech authorities that no Western studio could have obtained anywhere else in the world. The town of Most, in northern Bohemia, was in the process of being demolished and relocated to allow access to the lignite coal deposits beneath its foundations, a process of planned urban erasure that was already underway when the production arrived. Wolper's team was granted permission to blow up large portions of the existing town as part of the film's battle sequences. Real buildings, in the process of being vacated and scheduled for demolition anyway, were destroyed on camera in explosions that no set construction budget could have replicated. The production was also specifically denied one demolition: the local Communist Party headquarters building. Even in the context of extraordinary location access, there were bureaucratic limits that no film production was willing to test in the spring of 1968. The decision not to blow up the Communist Party building, production records suggest, was less a political calculation than a practical one. They did not want to accelerate the deterioration of a relationship with Czech authorities that was already under strain from the Central Intelligence Agency accusations. This is exactly why the battle sequences in the bridge at Remagen have a texture of physical destruction that later productions with larger budgets could not reproduce on controlled sets. The actual Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the bridge the film was named for, the bridge that had collapsed into the Rhine on March 17, 1945, 10 days after its capture, did not exist anymore and had not existed for over 2 decades. German authorities had an additional and more practical objection to providing the Rhine River as a filming location. The heavy river traffic of coal barges, tourist boats, and commercial shipping made the waterway essentially unusable for extended production work. The production therefore found the Davle Bridge over the Vltava River outside Prague, a structure sufficiently similar in construction and setting to serve as a stand-in. The Czech Ministry of Transportation closed the Davle Bridge to traffic for the entire summer of 1968, a decision that was genuinely controversial among Prague residents who used the bridge to reach summer homes in the surrounding countryside. Fake towers and a fake railway tunnel were constructed. A $250,000 tunnel was blasted into the east bank of the Vltava to complete the visual geography. The bridge that appears in the film is a convincing fabrication built around a real structure that bore only an approximate resemblance to the one it was representing. The military hardware that appears on the American side of the battle in the bridge at Remagen is historically inaccurate in ways that were well understood at the time and documented by critics and military enthusiasts immediately upon the Remagen-saved These film's release. The production used M24 Chaffee light tanks, which were Korea-era vehicles, standing in for the T-26E3 Pershing heavy tanks and M4 Sherman variants that the 9th Armored Division actually employed at Remagen in March 1945. Period correct. Sherman tanks were available in museums, private collections, and still in active service with the militaries of several smaller countries in the late 1960s. The production chose the M24s anyway, a decision that, based on surviving production correspondence, appears to have been driven primarily by availability and logistics rather than budget. The anachronism was noticed immediately. It damaged the film's claim to historical authenticity at the most visible possible level, the hardware that fills the frame throughout the battle sequences. A film that had gone to extraordinary lengths to blow up real buildings in a real Czech town used the wrong tanks. But the real problem was that the wrong tanks were not even the worst historical inaccuracy embedded in the production. Ken Hechler's 1957 nonfiction account was meticulous in its documentation of the actual events of March 7, 1945. The real platoon leader was Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, the first officer across the bridge. The first enlisted man across was Sergeant Alex Drabik. The German engineers had mined the bridge, but 2 Polish engineers who had been forcibly conscripted into the Wehrmacht cut the fuses, an act of quiet resistance that Hechler documented carefully and that the film entirely omits. The film's fictional counterparts, Lieutenant Hartmann for Timmerman, Sergeant Angelo for Drabik, are recognizable structural translations of real men whose actual stories were more morally complex than the screenplay could accommodate. The German officers who failed to destroy the bridge were, historically, executed by firing squad, a fact the film preserves in Robert Vaughn's character but strips of its specific documentary weight. Hechler, who served as the production's technical advisor, was present throughout the filming of a version of events he had documented firsthand. What he made of the divergences between his testimony and the screenplay he had been paid $5,000 to authorize is not recorded. This is exactly why the film operates most powerfully not as history but as argument, and why the argument it makes is more interesting than the history it distorts. The cinematography of The Bridge at Remagen was the work of Stanley Cortez, whose career arc is one of the more fascinating trajectories in Hollywood camera work. Cortez had shot Orson Welles' The Magnificent Ambersons in 1942, one of the most technically and artistically ambitious films in American cinema, and had subsequently built a reputation as a cinematographer of exceptional skill who was, by reputation, slow and expensive enough that major productions were cautious about hiring him. On the Bridge at Remagen, working in Panavision and deluxe color under genuine field conditions, real locations, real demolitions, a production being continuously disrupted by geopolitical events, Cortez produced work that the TCM notes describe as sharp and gritty in ways that added authentic texture to battle sequences that needed it badly. Contemporary critics who dismissed the film rarely addressed its visual language. Film scholars who have returned to Remagen in subsequent decades have consistently noted that Cortez's contribution was disproportionate to the credit it received. The stunt work for the bridge at Remagen was supervised by Hal Needham, a man who, in 1968, was one of Hollywood's most capable stunt coordinators and who would subsequently become one of its most commercially successful directors, eventually guiding Burt Reynolds through Smokey and the Bandit and building a career as a filmmaker of genuine popular consequence. His work on Remagen was, by the standards of late 1960s action cinema, genuinely impressive. Complex sequences integrating infantry movement, tank operation, artillery, and the physical destruction of real structures, choreographed under field conditions in a foreign country during a period of political instability. The stunt sequences are the film's most consistently praised element in retrospective assessments. Needham received the kind of industry credit that stunt coordinators typically received in 1968, acknowledgement within the industry, invisibility outside it. But the real problem was that even Needham's stunt work could not compensate for what the invasion had done to the production's coherence. After the Soviet invasion forced the production out of Czechoslovakia, Wolper relocated to West Germany and Italy to complete what remained. The bridge sequences that could not be finished at Davle were shot using a half-replica bridge constructed near Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer residence south of Rome, at a reported cost that consumed a significant portion of the $1,500,000 in losses the location shift had generated. The tonal difference between the authentic Czech locations, real towns, real demolitions, a real bridge, and the Italian replica sequences is visible in the finished film if you know what you are looking at. The light is different. The spatial relationships are slightly off. The geography of the final act does not entirely match the geography established in the first two-thirds. The invasion that ended the Prague Spring and silenced Alexander Dubček's democratic experiment also, in a very minor key, fractured the visual continuity of a war film about a different conflict entirely. The score for The Bridge at Remagen was composed by Elmer Bernstein, who had also scored In Harm's Way 4 years earlier, which creates an interesting footnote in the genealogy of late 1960s Hollywood war film music. Bernstein's work here is consistently cited by audiences and critics as one of the film's most effective elements, building tension in sequences where the editing and visual geography were fighting against each other, and providing emotional continuity across a film that had been physically assembled from locations in 3 different countries under chaotic conditions. His thematic material for the Vaughn character, the German major whose moral seriousness and institutional loyalty are destroyed by the same war machine he serves, carries more weight than the screenplay gives the character room to generate on its own. This is exactly why Robert Vaughn's performance became the film's most lasting critical legacy. Robert Vaughn plays Major Paul Kruger, the German officer whose structural counterpart to George Segal's American lieutenant gives the film its moral architecture and delivers what multiple retrospective assessments have identified as among the finest work of his career. His final scene, facing a firing squad after being executed by the SS for the crime of failing to destroy the bridge he was trying to save, contains a closing line whose specific quality has been noted by serious critics across decades without ever fully entering the canonical conversation about great war film performances. The performance is simultaneously the film's most explicitly anti-war argument and its most human moment, a man destroyed not by the enemy but by the institution that commissioned him. Vaughn himself played a fictionalized version of the invasion in a 2007 British Broadcasting Corporation radio production. The performance in Remagen deserved the kind of award attention it never received. The film opened in June 1969, at the precise worst moment Wolper could have chosen. The United States of America was 9 months into the Nixon administration. The anti-Vietnam protest movement had reached its most intense public expression, and a film celebrating the capture of a military objective by American soldiers, however cynically and ambivalently it framed that celebration, arrived into a cultural environment that had no use for its moral complexity and less patience for its genre. Wolper himself later acknowledged, with the kind of retrospective clarity that producers develop after a film underperforms, that distributing a war film at the height of Vietnam opposition was perhaps not the best idea. Critical reception was divided in ways that revealed more about the critics' political frameworks than about film. It was accused simultaneously of being too realistic and not realistic enough. A paradox that suggests reviewers were using the film as a screen for arguments they were actually having about a different war happening in real time. but the algorithm of history has vindicated the bridge at Remagen in ways its 1969 reviewers could not access from inside the Vietnam moment. The film's cynicism about institutional military authority, its consistent demonstration that the men who command from maps regard the men who die on bridges as logistical variables rather than human beings, reads not as a World War II story, but as a permanent structural argument about how armies consume the people who serve them. Vaughn's German major and Segal's American lieutenant are, in the film's moral universe, the same man in different uniforms: competent, loyal, war-weary, and entirely expendable to the institutions they have served with distinction. The fact that the institution that executes Kruger wears a Nazi uniform, while the institution that exhausts Hartman wears an American one, is the film's most subversive argument, delivered so quietly that critics in 1969 missed it almost entirely. Retrospective assessments consistently locate Remagen as superior to similarly scaled productions of its era, better than Anzio, more honest than most of the roadshow epics it was competing against, and structurally ahead of its cultural moment in ways that the cultural moment could not recognize. The production of The Bridge at Remagen ended the way it had proceeded, in circumstances beyond anyone's control, shaped by geopolitical forces the studio could neither anticipate nor manage. Wolper stopped making theatrical films after 1972, returning 2 decades later to produce L.A. Confidential, a triumph that retroactively repositioned his career but left Remagen exactly where it had always been. A film assembled under impossible conditions from the labor of uncredited writers, the bravery of crew members who stayed behind to film an actual invasion, the stunt work of a man who would become famous for something else entirely, and the performances of actors who deserved more sustained attention than the cultural moment allowed them. Richard Yates never received another significant Hollywood assignment. He died in 1992. His revolutionary road out of print and his screenplay credit on a 1969 war film constituting his only lasting connection to cinema. The bridge at the real Remagen had collapsed into the Rhine in March 1945. The film named for it collapsed into relative obscurity for reasons that had nothing to do with its quality and everything to do with timing. And here is the question that the film leaves embedded in its structure, like a charge that failed to detonate. If The Bridge at Remagen had been released in 1965, before Vietnam consumed the American capacity to think clearly about what war films are actually saying, would it have been recognized as the anti-institutional argument it has always been? And if the answer is yes, what does that tell you about the relationship between cultural timing and critical intelligence, and about how many films like it we have dismissed for reasons that were never really about the films at all? Leave that in the comments. The argument is the point. If this investigation changed how you see The Bridge at Remagen, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.